The last time John Dramani Mahama met with the press as a sitting president was in January 2016, his last year of his first term. Today, 8 months into his second term, he met with the press again, which by Ghana standard is commendable. However, the big issue that was looming over his meet the press in 2016 was him accepting two detainees from the US, courtesy of a deal he had with President Obama at the time. And today, Friday, September 12, 2025, the big issue looming over President Mahama's meet the press is him accepting 14 deportees from the US under a deal he made with President Trump. Is this deja vu? New day, same old issue? Or is it a different issue? Well, I'll give you my thoughts on that based on the law, the deal, and historical data. My name is Enebi Tony. I'm a Ghanaian writer based in the US. And if you are interested in intellectual conversations about the economy of Ghana and Ghana's foreign policy, this is the channel for you. Subscribe. All right, let's go into it. So, President Mahama, in his Meet the Press event, which he held just this evening, it is around 6 p.m. in the US, which is around midnight in Ghana. So he held it like 3 hours ago. There were a lot of issues that came up, of course, because different media houses were asking different questions. And two issues he spoke about caught my attention, which I hope to look into in future. Number one, he talked about the fact that his government has earmarked $2 billion to be spent on healthcare because the US has cut funds to Ghana because of the cancellation of the US aid by the Trump administration. And two, he also mentioned the fact that the United States and Africa's deal, AGWA, it's called, I think, African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was passed somewhere in the 90s, early 2000s, will elapse September, which means that this month is the last month of AGWA. And President Mahama declared AGWA effectively dead. He said President Trump's attitude towards trade and tariff has made it impossible to negotiate the revamping of AGWA. Those are two very critical issues which I hope to look into in future, hopefully. But the big issue now, the breaking news is 14 deportees from other West African countries have been accepted into Ghana. And this made me think about the fact that when President Mahama was president the first term, Ghana accepted 2 detainees, former Guantanamo Bay detainees who were Yemeni citizens. And that was based on a deal he had with, what's the name? President Obama. So if you're unfamiliar with this, let me feed you in. So when 9/11 happened, the US passed what they call the Patriot Act. And under Patriot Act, the war of terrorism was declared. And as part of the war on terrorism, people who the US suspected to be terrorists were picked up without any regard for habeas corpus, without any trial, were detained in Guantanamo, I don't know how to pronounce this word, Guantanamo Bay. And the US has a detaining center over there. It was a military base. And a lot of these people were tried under martial law, and there's been a lot of discourse around the Gitmo detainees, whether it was lawful or not, whether it was an affront on international law. But these conversations were hard to have at the time because 9/11 has happened. The whole world saw the Twin Towers coming down, and the whole world saw thousands of citizens of different countries getting unalived under what was an Al Qaeda attack on the US. So the world watched on and allowed the US to abuse the law on or the rights of people they suspected to be terrorists. So when President Obama took office in 2009, he vowed to end the Gitmo Detaining Center, and he didn't entirely end the Gitmo Center. But what he did was, some of the people who were being held at the Gitmo who were not credibly found to be terrorists were being left to go back. But some of these countries these people were from didn't have a good relationship with the US. So Germany and the US, for example, didn't have a type of diplomatic relationship where the US can just send two people the US have called terrorists back into Yemen. So the US started soliciting their friends around the world to accept some of these detainees they want to release. So President Obama negotiated with President Mahama, and two Gitmo detainees or ex-Gitmo detainees were sent to Ghana. And they were supposed to live in Ghana for 2 years, and after 2 years, they were free to go anywhere they wanted. And this was a big scandal in Ghana. One, these people had a label of terrorism, and Ghana, even though we've never had a terrorist event happen in Ghana, Ghanaians are very, very conscious of protecting our nationals from terrorist attacks, right? So the president accepting people who were suspected terrorists into the country was a big national scandal, so much so that the president was sued in court. And the Supreme Court ruled that President Mahama accepting two Gitmo detainees into the country was unconstitutional. Why? Because under the Constitution of Ghana, for the president to enter into a bilateral relationship with another country, Parliament will have to rectify that agreement. And President Mahama didn't go to Parliament to accept those two detainees, so he flouted the law. And in 2017, the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. So here we are, new year, new law, I guess, or old law. President Trump of the US, when he was running for president, was vowing to be hard on immigrants who were living in the US illegally, and was vowing to send them back to their home countries and, deport them. While deportation by the US is something the US vowed to do and President Trump vowed to do, the way deportation works is, if you are deporting somebody to a different countries, that country will have to accept the person. So the US can say, we want to deport all Nigerian nationals living in the US back to Nigeria. And if the Nigerian government doesn't agree to accept them, the US can't send them to Nigeria. Because while the US have the right to deport people from the US doesn't have the right to force another country to accept them. You understand? Every country in the world under international law is technically equal. I say technically because we know the animal farm story. All animals are equal, but not really equally equal. What's the animal farm quote? Yeah, you know the animal farm quote. Not all countries are equally equal. I'll put it that way. So the US needed to find alternatives to those countries. And so the US started putting pressure on Ghana. We all saw with our eyes how much pressure the US was putting on Ghana. The US put pressure on our Foreign Affairs Office through the new visa policy. The US put 50% tariff on Ghana. The US started threatening Ghana with more sanctions. FBI was, arresting people in Ghana. Ghana was under immense pressure from the Trump administration to accept deportees. But because of what happened under President Obama in 2016, Ghana was not willing to just accept deportees from Trump. And so the pressure keep getting on, or how do I put this? The pressure keep getting worse and worse. So the president of Ghana, John Dramani Mahama, decided to split the baby. The Solomon wisdom. The president of Ghana entered a deal with the US to accept West African nationals into Ghana. And why West African nationals? How? Because you remember I said the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional for President Mahama to accept the Yemen citizens into Ghana in 2016. So what gives President Mahama the power to do that, accept West African nationals from the US in 2025? That's a good question, and I have an answer for you. It starts in 1979, actually, before 1979. If you are Ghanaian or Nigerian or even West African, you know the expression Ghana must go. This was when in the 1960s and 1970s, West African countries, not just Ghana and Nigeria, were sacking West African citizens from their country. So, for example, Ghana was sacking Nigerians, Senegalese, and other West African from Ghana because, according to the government of Ghana, these foreigners were taking jobs by Ghanaians. Does that sound familiar? And Nigeria also responded by sacking Ghanaians and other West African nationals. Senegal also did the same. I think Guinea and other West African countries did the same. But the reason why we call it Ghana must go was because in Nigeria, most West Africans who were living in Nigeria in the 1970s were Ghanaians. And the Nigerian citizens saw the expelling of West African citizens, specifically Ghanaians, as a nationalist agenda by their then president. So they were chanting for Ghanaians to leave Nigeria. That is how we got the name Ghana must go. That is why that bag, that check bag, is called Ghana must go. It was a political fight between the governments of Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Mali, and other West African countries. But us Ghanaians and Nigerians don't care about other West Africans. We only care about each other, right? So Ghana must go wasn't a good thing, right? Because the West African governments realized that we are friends. We live close to each other. Our citizens intermarry. Ghanaians have Nigerian wives. Nigerians have Ghanaian wives. Togolese have Ghanaian wives. Ghanaians have Togolese wives, So our relationship is too strong for us to just fire at each other. Let's find a solution. That is when they came up with what they call the ECOWAS Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, Residents, and Establishment. So ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, today I believe ECOWAS have 15 countries, and this at the time was 16 countries. These 16 countries came together and said, let's put together a protocol to make it easy for all West African countries to pass laws to accept other West African citizens into their country. And so I say protocol because, like, again, all these countries are sovereign countries, so they'll have to pass these laws in their individual countries by themselves. And as it stands now, every West African country has passed the protocol into law. So in Ghana, if you are from an ECOWAS country, you have right to entry, right to residence, and technically right to establishment. We'll talk about right to establishment later. So right to entry means that if you are from a different ECOWAS country, you can enter Ghana without visa. So I remember my friend Kwame Rasta. One time I was just sleeping in my house and he called me that, Tony, do you want to go to Nigeria? I'm like, yeah, but I don't have a passport on me. It's like, do you have your student ID? I'm like, yeah. And so me and my boy Kwame Rasta went to Nigeria to attend a book festival. And that's what inspired me to write my first book. This was in 2019, I believe. And I didn't need a visa. I just needed my student ID to drive from Ghana through Togo, Benin into Nigeria because my ID proved that I am a West African living in a West African country, right? But if you are getting on a plane to go to a different West African country, you need your ECOWAS passport. By road, you don't need it. But by plane, you need your ECOWAS passport. You just don't need a visa. I've flown from Ghana to Sierra Leone before. I just needed a passport. I got to Sierra Leone and they stamped it. I went into Sierra Leone. And two, right to residence. Right to residence means that if you go to an ECOWAS country, you get to stay there for up to 90 days. I remember when I flew to Sierra Leone, right? I decided to stay there for 2 weeks and I really enjoyed my stay in Sierra Leone, so I ended up staying for 3 weeks. I didn't need to re-up my visa. I'm from an ECOWAS country, right? So, the right to establishment is a little complicated. What that means is that people from other ECOWAS countries should be allowed to establish businesses in other ECOWAS countries. And if you're a Ghanaian and you live in Ghana, even especially Accra, you know that if you go to Tiptoe Lane, where a lot of electronics, specifically phones and laptops, are sold, you know most of the people who sell phones and laptops in Ghana are Nigerians. And a lot of them are technically protected under the right to establishment. I say technically because there are other laws that technically doesn't protect them. So in Ghana, if you are a foreigner, you can't go into retail in Ghana. So is selling phone and laptop retail? The court of Ghana have not answered that question yet, so we don't know. So maybe one day somebody will take these Nigerians who sell phones for you to court and then Nigerians will be asked not to sell phones in Ghana anymore. Maybe. There's also always that possibility, but I don't think that will happen because while by law is a gray area, by practice, Ghanaians also live in Nigeria and do business in Nigeria a lot. My ex-girlfriend's father was Ghanaian. She was half Nigerian and her father was a Ghanaian who went to establish business in Nigeria. A lot of Ghanaians do that. Actually, a lot of English teachers in Ghana, actually, a lot of English teachers in Nigerian private schools are Ghanaians. I don't know why English is what Ghanaians are teaching Nigerians. I know why. Too well. Under this protocol, President Mahama has some leeway to accept ECOWAS citizens into the country, which he based as his authority to accept these West African detainees or West African deportees. And, you know, I am actually liking President Mahama's second term more than his first term. President Mahama's first term, he did a lot of things without regard for laws and rules. And under his second term, he's taking steps to ensure that he has legal backing for a lot of things he did. And his decision seems very sound. I was just watching his press conference where he was talking about why he, through the Bank of Ghana, injected some money into the Ghana foreign forex market and why he has taken that money away now. And that sounded like a logical, decision. So by law, President Mahama is protected. Even PR wise, I believe President Mahama is protected. Why is that? Those two Gitmo detainees that President Mahama accepted into the country in 2016 were victims of bad media PR. So from 2001 to 2016, the US media, which a lot of Ghanaians consume through CNN, BBC, and the rest, painted people from the Middle East as terrorists. So if people who are suspected terrorists are coming into the country, people who consume media have a reasonable reason to be scared of them. Reasonable reason to be scared of them, right? But detainees or deportees from other West African countries, whether they are Nigerians, Senegalese, Malians, while there is a certain reputation around Nigerians in Ghana, generally Ghanaians don't have an apprehension of other West Africans. So President Mahama is going to have an easier time convincing Ghanaians that his decision to accept these deportees from President Trump is the right decision. What about you? Do you think that he made the right decision or not? Also, what do you think that President Trump's decision to use the stick instead of the carrot to force Ghana to accept deportees, instead of doing what President Obama did, which was use the carrot, which is convince Ghana through diplomatic means to accept the detainees? What do you think about it? Because when President Mahama was speaking right now, he said something about President Trump being a more transactional person. So it's kind of hard to deal with. And I think President Mahama was very critical of President Trump in his press conference, and his criticism of President Trump is kind of justified. And let me know what you think. Also, subscribe to this channel, and I will come your way with more of topical issues that deal with foreign policy, trade, history, or other issues that intellectual minds care about.